On a Prayer, Faith is Awaken, by Elton Thomas, Episode 7, A Prayer for Protection. The night was thick with the kind of oppressive heat that clung to everything like a second skin. Even the breeze that wound through the narrow alleyways of the old industrial district of St. Louis offered no relief. It was one of those nights where the air seemed too heavy to breathe, and the distant hum of the city felt muffled, as if the world were holding its breath. Dusty Rhymes stood in the shadows, his back pressed against the cold brick wall of an abandoned warehouse. Sweat trickled down his temple, but he barely noticed. His eyes were focused on the far end of the alley, where a faint light flickered from the street lamp that had seen better days. The streets were empty, but Dusty knew better than to trust appearances. In this part of the city, things moved in the dark, things that most people didn't want to see. He shifted his weight slightly, his muscles tensed, his senses on high alert. His heartbeat was steady, but his mind raced with the possibilities. He had been tracking the black van for 2 days, ever since his conversation with Miles had pointed him in the right direction. It had taken longer than he liked, but Dusty had finally caught a break. A surveillance camera from a liquor store had caught the van passing by the night Mila disappeared. From there, he had followed the trail, connecting the dots across the city until he ended up here. This was the place. He could feel it in his gut. The warehouse at the end of the street had been abandoned for years, its windows shattered, the metal doors rusting at the hinges. But tonight, there was movement inside. Dusty had seen the faint glow of lights through the cracks in the windows, the silhouettes of figures moving in and out. They were careful, deliberate, as if they knew they were being watched. Dusty's jaw tightened. His mind was sharp, his instincts telling him that he was close. Too close for comfort. He pulled out his phone and glanced at the time. It was late, past midnight, but time had lost meaning. Every hour that passed felt like a countdown, a race against the clock to find Mila before it was too late. Dusty had seen too many cases like this, where the victims were never found, or if they were beyond saving. But he refused to let that happen to Mila. As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, the familiar weight of his gun pressed against his hip. He had been in dangerous situations before, had faced men who thought they could get away with anything because the law never reached the places they operated. But tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was coming, something Dusty couldn't predict or prepare for. He inhaled deeply, steeling himself for what was to come. He knew he couldn't storm in guns blazing, not without backup. But he also knew that time wasn't on his side. Mila could be inside that warehouse, scared and alone, and every second he hesitated felt like a betrayal. Dusty's fingers brushed the edge of his jacket, where his phone buzzed softly. He glanced down at the screen. A text message from Pastor Ethan. "Praying for you tonight. Stay safe, Dust." Dusty stared at the words for a moment, his heart clenching in an unfamiliar way. The pastor had become something of a grounding force in his life, though Dusty wasn't entirely sure why. He didn't believe in the power of prayer, not the way Ethan did. But there was something about knowing that someone was thinking of him, hoping for his safety, that made him pause. He typed a quick reply, his fingers moving faster than his mind. "Thanks. I'm close. I'll be fine." But as he slipped the phone back into his pocket, something gnawed at the edge of his consciousness. Something he didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't shake. Dusty had spent most of his life relying on his instincts, his training, and his unwavering belief that he could control the outcome of any situation with enough preparation. But lately, things had been happening that defied that belief. Things he couldn't explain. He pushed the thought away. Now wasn't the time for doubt. Dusty moved quickly but quietly along the alley, sticking close to the shadows. His boots barely made a sound on the cracked pavement as he approached the warehouse. The closer he got, the more his pulse quickened, the tension building in his chest. His mind was sharp, every detail of the environment etched into his memory. The rusted fire escape clinging to the side of the building, the broken windows that lined the upper floors, the faint scent of oil and metal that lingered in the air. He reached the side of the warehouse, his back pressed against the cold steel door. For a moment, he closed his eyes, taking in the sounds around him, the distant rumble of a truck on the highway, the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe, the soft rustle of wind through the cracks in the walls. But there was something else too. Voices, low and muffled, but unmistakable. Dusty's jaw clenched. He was close. He crouched down, moving toward one of the broken windows, the jagged glass casting strange shadows across the floor. Peering through the gap, he saw them, 3 men gathered near the center of the warehouse, talking in hushed tones. One of them, a tall figure with broad shoulders and a gun strapped to his belt, was clearly in charge. Dusty recognized him immediately. Curtis, one of Jackson Brown's enforcers. Dusty's heart pounded in his chest as his eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of Mila. But the warehouse was large, its corners shrouded in darkness. His breath came in shallow bursts as he tried to make out the details, his mind racing with possibilities. Just then, one of the men glanced in his direction. Dusty's pulse spiked, and he ducked back behind the wall, his body tense with the anticipation of being discovered. He waited, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, listening for any sign that they had seen him. But the voices inside continued, undisturbed. Dusty exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He couldn't wait any longer. If Mila was in there, he had to move now. But he was outnumbered, and there was no telling what kind of firepower Curtis and his men had. His hand instinctively went to his gun, the cool metal a reassuring presence. He had always relied on his training, his ability to think on his feet, to get him out of tight spots. But tonight, something felt different. His thoughts flickered back to Pastor Ethan's message, the quiet reassurance that someone was praying for him. Dusty shook his head, trying to focus. He didn't have time for that kind of thinking. He needed a plan. Fast. Just as he was about to move, a sound behind him made his blood run cold, the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. "Don't move." The voice was low, gravelly, and filled with menace. Dusty froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, he raised his hands, his breath shallow as he tried to assess the situation. He hadn't heard anyone approach, hadn't sensed any danger. But now, with the barrel of a gun pressed against his back, he realized just how vulnerable he was. "Turn around," the voice commanded. Dusty complied, moving slowly, his hands still raised. His eyes locked onto the man standing in front of him. A wiry figure with cold, calculating eyes and a twisted smile that sent a chill down Dusty's spine. "Looks like you've been snooping where you don't belong," the man sneered, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. Dusty's mind raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of panic and calculation. He had been in tight spots before, but this was different. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely exposed. For the first time in a long time, Dusty felt fear claw its way into his chest. But just as the man stepped forward, ready to pull the trigger, something happened. The air around Dusty seemed to shift, like the briefest whisper of a breeze on a still night. His pulse quickened, his skin tingling with a sensation he couldn't explain. And then, before he could even comprehend what was happening, the man in front of him stumbled backward, his gun slipping from his hand as if some unseen force had knocked him off balance. Dusty's heart raced, his mind struggling to make sense of what he had just witnessed. He didn't know how or why, but in that split second, his life had been spared. Without wasting another moment, Dusty lunged forward, his body moving on instinct. He knocked the man to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he wrestled for control. The gun clattered to the ground, spinning out of reach, and Dusty drove his elbow into the man's ribs, sending him sprawling. Panting, Dusty stood over him, his mind reeling from what had just happened. He didn't have time to think about it, didn't have time to question the impossible. All he knew was that somehow, against all odds, he had survived. And Mila was still waiting to be found.